Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bobby Ghosh. I'm from Bloomberg. I write opinion pieces, and I'm a member of the, whoops, I'm also destructive. I write opinion pieces for Bloomberg and editorials as well. I'm going to start out by making one promise. We will not be discussing any elections. We're going to talk about what hasn't really been explored at any great length yesterday or today so far. It is the somewhat less appreciated danger of the damage that disinformation, misinformation, malinformation can do. I, in my previous life, was a war reporter, was a conflict journalist, and one of the truisms that I would hear quite a lot was that real war is economic warfare, not the warfare that I was covering, not the guns and explosions that were going off around me. But I think we've now reached a stage where information warfare is in some ways much more insidious and dangerous than even economic warfare. And today, with this panel, I'm going to try and explore the intersection between information warfare and economic warfare, how the one can be used by malignant actors to the service of the other. I've got a tremendous panel here. I'm going to briefly introduce them, and then we'll launch into the discussion. I'll start from the far left with Alastair Aitken of Storyful. Next to him is John Montgomery, who is with GroupM and can talk to us about the advertising industry's take on this. Michelle Strah is from the ICJ program at John Jay College in the City University of New York. And Bret Schafer is from the Alliance of Securing Democracy. I've asked each of them to start with a 5-minute overview of their take on the topic, and then we will get into the discussions. Bret, why don't you take us?
Well, first, I just want to echo your point of how nice it is to have a conversation about disinformation that's not focusing on the 2020 elections. I think not just because it provides a little variety, but also looking at disinformation solely through a political lens has been very problematic for how we viewed this in the US and Europe, at least. It's problematic, A, because it has made the topic of disinformation partisan, at least in the US, but B, measuring the effects of political disinformation on political outcomes is incredibly challenging. In the US context, for 3 years we've been having a debate as to whether Russian interference was the culprit or the reason behind the election of Trump. Was it the interference? Was it the fact people liked Trump? Was it the fact they didn't like Clinton? Was it the fact that Republicans voted for him because they've been Republican for 50 years and it's part of their identity? But when you talk about markets, the cause and effect is a little bit more clear. And I think it's a little bit more tangible for everyone to understand how disinformation in the marketplace can affect them on a personal level. And to illustrate that point, I want to talk about the Shed at Dulwich. So for those who don't know what the Shed at Dulwich is, it was a restaurant in London that came online in 2017. And when it came online, it was one of these kind of very avant-garde, by appointment only restaurants. It started as the lowest ranked restaurant on TripAdvisor in London. Positive reviews started rolling in. They got 5-star ratings. It kept moving up and moving up and moving up. Within a year, the Shed at Dulwich was the #1 ranked restaurant in the City of London. The punchline here is the Shed at Dulwich did not exist. It was a hoax. It was a joke by a writer at Vice UK, basically to point out how easy the information space is to manipulate. So this is one guy with a few friends who in less than a year was able to manipulate the most trusted ranking site online in a city with more than 18,000 restaurants and get his restaurant to the top. So if you expand from that and you take a real life Shed at Dulwich where they're not just posting positive reviews, they're posting negative reviews about competitors. So now they're driving local mom and pop shops out of business. Very clear to most people how that could be damaging to them, to their business, et cetera. But if you expand a little bit further from that, and you look, okay, now we're just not talking about restaurants or the shop on the corner. Now we're talking about a multinational corporation, a publicly traded company. Example of this, in 2015, there was a rogue Scottish trader who put out fake marketing reports through a Twitter account. And his goal here, he had no kind of vendetta about these companies. He wanted to create market fluctuation and profit off it. So this was caught fairly quickly, but it caused shareholders to lose $1.6 million, very short period of time. This was one guy, again, with no real resources, no real technical ability. So if you take that, and then you look at all these companies online, these sort of disinformation mercenaries for hire, or what I tend to look at, nation states with professional intelligence services, the damage can be immense to the private sector. So again, I tend to study nation state influence, information operations. I've looked at the Russians primarily. Where we tend to look for the Russians to be most active is in the energy sector, obviously. But a case that was actually mentioned this morning that I've looked at in detail are their efforts to damage the implementation of 5G in the West. So RT, for a year and a half, has just inundated Western audiences with negative commentary about 5G. It's going to give your kids cancer. It's going to be apocalyptic. It's going to end privacy. It's going to affect weather patterns. It's been this nonstop drip of negative content. At the same time, the Russian Federation is rolling out 5G through Huawei. So while they're telling Western audience that 5G is going to kill them, they're promoting Huawei as this great corporate innovator. So you're hobbling in the West the rollout of 5G while moving forward with 5G domestically. Now, as Yevon mentioned this morning, you look at times of war, what can be done there? But as you mentioned, economic warfare can happen all the time. So just to wrap this up, I think it has been a huge mistake that we have looked at disinformation through a political lens or through the lens of elections. You've even seen the platforms themselves. They've set up these war rooms 2 weeks before an election as if that's going to solve the problem. But when you're talking about economic influence or the ability to affect markets, the threat landscape is incredibly vast. The window of opportunity is always open, and the damage can be immense and irreversible. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Michelle?
Thank you, Brad. Just kidding, Bret. I couldn't agree more with...
Can you guys hear her? I don't...
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I did not turn it off, I promise. So I couldn't agree more with what you said, Bret. And to frame it even a little further, the World Economic Forum in 2019 asked the member states who attended to rank what they saw as the short-term risk outlook for nation states in the world. The number one, 91% of countries responded and said economic conflict and economic warfare. So not terrorist attacks, not conventional warfare, economic warfare. Out of those top 10, however, 4 were directly related to cyber attacks and disinformation. So number 4 was cyber attacks and theft of data and money from financial institutions, cyber attacks to infrastructure. Number 8, fake news. And number 10, personal identity theft. So the risks that nation states are facing right now are identified solely in economic terms. The dollar loss, it's been estimated, there's different metrics to do this, from cyber attacks, including those that include disinformation, over $6 billion US per year. And that's actually a very conservative estimate. That's just corporate losses. So we're talking about an extremely large amount of money. And to Bret's point is by narrowly focusing the discussion on disinformation from a counterterror or political science perspective, we actually, inadvertently close out the ability to identify a series of actors and stakeholders which I believe are necessary to truly combat this, both from the political and economic front. So when we look at this from a criminological perspective, yes, election fraud and election corruption is a problem, not going to deny that, but also one thing I've been tracking in my research is since 2016, more instances, election fraud, yes, but most of the disinformation have fallen under 4 crime types. One is financial fraud, including payment in cryptocurrency. This is mostly in East Asia, Singapore, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and we heard the Home Secretary from Singapore yesterday speak about this. Content and advertising fraud. Cyber-enabled trafficking, a lot under drug and wildlife trafficking, and then, of course, violent crimes, homicide, and assault. So the majority of crimes that are occurring using disinformation are actually not, to your point, election fraud at all. We have become very good from a cyber criminology perspective from identifying and counteracting cybercrime, but for some reason we've kind of fallen into a challenge around disinformation, and I think some of it is because of the definitional challenges that this brings up. Is it dis, is it mis, is it mal? When actually from a criminology perspective and from the perspective of fighting transnational organized crime, we look at this from the perspective of actors and behaviors, right? And by identifying the actors and their behaviors, including the networks that are associated with this, we actually have a much better understanding of the attack surface. And in particular around disinformation, we speak a lot about the digital platforms, the social media giants, and I'm going to take them to task today, so don't be afraid. I will definitely bring that up. But we've inadvertently closed out another set of actors in this. Is the social media platforms themselves don't actually create the disinformation, nor is it published that way. It's actually a tripartite model where we have, yes, the social networks, but also almost like a middleman, a series of tools and services. These can be analytics, it can be publishing, and ironically, these tools and services are often freely available. They're legitimate analytics tools, they're legitimate follower tools. They're used by companies in legitimate fashions, but they're repurposed by criminal groups. The third leg of this stool or triangle is we have to think of the criminal networks themselves. Whether it's a politically motivated terror group, whether it's an organized crime group, the model for this is actually crime as a service. Most of this, just like IT everywhere in the world, is actually outsourced. So the criminal groups are by nature generally very transnational. So in November 2018, around the exact same time that the Internet Research Agency was being identified in the US for the election fraud, we had a parallel investigation operating out of the Eastern District of New York for a separate Russian organized crime group based in Brooklyn that was running an ad fraud campaign that, guess what, was operating exactly like the political and election fraud, except their goal was monetary. They stole $7 million from US companies that reported this to the FBI because they had been fooled into buying what they believed were legitimate ad services. So through 2 mechanisms, one was actually faking websites and faking followers. The other was a series of botnets. They actually impersonated and created over 650,000 IP addresses. So ran very much like a disinformation campaign, but for a financial motive. So while these were Russian nationals who operated this, they ended up fleeing to Bulgaria, Malaysia, Estonia. So the investigation of this required an incredibly complex countermeasures that required cooperation from those countries, as well as France, Germany, Switzerland, multiple corporations in the US, and the way, as well as looking at what tools and services were involved in this, some of which were legitimate. So to close, my point is, by looking at this not only from the political perspective, but from the economic and cybercrime perspective, we actually lay bare some of the complexity of the actors that are involved, and it allows us to have a better understanding of the social networks and some of the tools of the trade.
John.
Thanks, Michelle. I work for an advertising agency called GroupM. It's the largest ad agency in the world that places media. We place about 25% of all advertising impressions in the world today. I don't say that as a boast. I just say that we see a great deal of ad impressions running through the system. We place around about 10 billion impressions a month. So that's an awful lot of digital advertising. And that's really just to give you a scale of the scale of things. I think, as most of the people in the room know, advertising funds much of the internet. A lot of what's on the web, Google, Facebook, and many of the things that we use are there because of advertising, for good or for bad. But I think advertising is likely to be around about $340 billion this year on digital. So it's an enormous market. And what's attractive to marketers about digital is that you can target consumers very precisely. You can get the right ad in front of the right consumer at the right time, the right number of times, if we do it correctly. And with that kind of use of data comes complexity, and with complexity becomes risk. So I have this title called Head of Brand Safety, Head of Global Brand Safety, which is a bit of a strange title. And what we mean by brand safety is that any risk that a brand might face in the digital supply chain, and I'll tell you about some of them now, is what we try and mitigate. And those risks fall into essentially three areas: financial risks, legal risks, and reputational risks. Financial risks are things like ad fraud, which, depending on which statistics you might believe, could be anything between $20 billion and $60 billion a year. Much of that is perpetrated out of China. It's very difficult to measure that. That's why the range is so big. So if it's $60 billion, you do the math, it could be 20% of all of the digital impressions out there could be perpetrated by bots or ad stacking or other forms of ad fraud. Other forms of financial risk are that the ad is not viewable in the frame. Sometimes the ad doesn't render properly, or you know from your own behavior, if you're scrolling down a social network, the ad may not be in the frame at all. And we call that viewability. And only about 50% of ads are actually viewable in the frame, yet advertisers pay for that. So that's another financial risk. Legal risks are things like data and privacy protections. You'll know about GDPR. There are similar laws coming into place in the US, but also things like IP infringement and contractual compliance are other financial risks. But one that's probably the most concerning for clients is reputational risk. And that's when ads appear adjacent to inappropriate content on the web. You know, brands spend billions of dollars over decades building the reputation of their brands, and they don't want to see that besmirched when they appear next to extremist content, next to pornographic content, in fact, next to any inappropriate content at all. And so they're very concerned about the reputational damage. So those are the areas that, that brand safety covers. And I think the good news is that we have very sophisticated measurement techniques. Alastair will tell you about his business in a minute. And if we use those measurement techniques, we're able to identify brand unsafe content or risky content and then mitigate against it. And we have a multi-point process. We have about 3,000 media planners across the world, and each of them follows a fairly rigorous kind of operational procedure to make sure that our ads are measured and that we avoid ad fraud, and we make sure that our ads are placed where we want them to be placed. So largely, that part of it is under control. However, and misinformation, which is what we're here to discuss today, is altogether more difficult. It's very difficult to identify it in the way that we've been identifying inappropriate content up to now. There are very sophisticated techniques to identify images or text around hate speech, around inappropriate content. But of course, disinformation doesn't always contain that kind of thing. We have to rely on blacklists and identifying the websites and the URLs, which are really hard to do. And so our advertisers don't place ads intentionally adjacent to inappropriate content. But when their ads are seen there, it damages their reputation. And just by the way, when consumers see an ad next to inappropriate content or content that they don't like, they don't blame the website as much as they blame the brand, although the brand had limited control over that. And then, of course, there's a further financial issue around disinformation, rather, and that is it's being used to inject malware into the JavaScript. Because most of the content now lives in the cloud, the risks of exposing the ad calls to malware have increased exponentially. And so it's a way for bad players to inject malware into the JavaScript, which is being used more and more. So there's a financial risk, a reputational risk in disinformation too, which just increases the overall the overall complexity of the area. I'll leave it at that, and I'm sure we'll discuss it some more.
Alastair?
So 2 years ago, in 2 weeks' time, I finished 30 years in the British Army, where I was lucky enough. I spent 5 years creating our first counter-disinformation, counter-propaganda, counter-information warfare organization. So we were talking about these things before it became cool and fashionable. We certainly wouldn't have been able to pack out an audience like this. We may have got enough people to fill these seats. And as I was leaving, I had a couple of senior business figures who said, look, you need to come and have a look at what's happening in commerce. And I admit, I got a bit, use the British expression, a bit sniffy. You really don't understand. It's not the same as, governmental, public sector, election integrity. And I was sort of taken around to look at the problem, and I was genuinely blown away by what is going on in the private sector in terms of disinformation and information risks. And I'll just try and explain what those are. And it was an eye-opening moment that I had been dim. I'd been blind to this, having stood on panels and given endless hours of lectures about, Peter was talking about unrestricted warfare, sort of Chinese doctrine, about our own British doctrine from 1942-44, about economic and information warfare combined. And I completely missed the fact that in terms of malign actors and malign activity, there is no divide between the two. The information and the economic are intertwined. So we tend to look at the problem, firstly on a principle of breadth. So we try and look right the way across 26, 27 social media platforms, fringe networks, and then into mainstream media and market data. And the reason we do that is because we're addressing two specific problems. And they are, I think it was Milo who said yesterday on his panel, these are tactics. They're not end effects. They are tactics in the way they're used. The first is disinformation. I'm not going to redefine it. And what we would call information manipulation. So anything that is true that is being manipulated. And this is quite significant because the manipulation of information is far more of an issue than disinformation, which is a niche tactic within it. And we bucket it up into 3 areas of corporate risk. So the first would be if you are a company that has an interest in an international market. So, and it's not just competing with Russian interests. If you look, and I'm sure most people in the room have read the Oxford University Computational Propaganda Programme's report a couple of weeks ago that cites 78 different countries that use this as a tactic, 78, including the Netherlands, which really, slightly surprised me. So 78 countries, if you are competing with and entering into markets where there are state-owned companies where that country is prepared to use these tactics against you as a company. Or if you're perceived as an element of soft power of an international rival. So close to here, if you're Qatar Airways or if you're the BN Group, then undoubtedly you are seen by others and is institute of soft power of his nation state. And therefore, this is a tactic that's employed against you. The second area is what we'd group as corporate warfare. So corporate dark arts, nothing new. It has existed for ages. And if I'm brutally honest, the things that I've seen companies do to each other would have had me in jail when I was in uniform. Really skirting the edge of legality and way over the morality issue. Where we get into this, where it's being employed as a niche tactic, so only a tactic, it's not entire campaigns, is around areas like mergers and acquisitions, IPOs, shareholder activism, arising cases of it being used, and into market manipulation where it gets slightly darker. And you can buy these services. The third area, and it's on an exponential growth in the United States, but is increasing everywhere depending on what that information environment looks like, is what we'd group as activism. We used to describe it as extremism, but what was extremist 12 months ago has become mainstream, and it's very difficult to put it into an extremist category. And I think, again, 12 months ago, we kind of bucketed up a lot of the attacks on corporates were emanating probably in an organized way from right-wing extremist groups, because they had a degree of organization, a degree of control. There were lots of veterans there who, quite frankly, were using military-style tactics. That's now changed. And where we see a real rise is in sort of capability are liberal and left activist groups that are coming up to the same standard of complexity and competency in this field of using this tactic against corporates who take a different social or political stance to the one they agree with. Now, to give you a current case study, because, again, this is moving quite quickly. A few months ago, I'd probably say 4 months ago, I'd be quite comfortable in just describing those three bubbles, 3 legs of a stool. But in actual fact, it's developing into a scenario where these are becoming merged, where what we see is different levels, so corporate actors, states, and activist groupings, all acting in concert around particular issues where it suits them. The most public at the minute would be, and those within the US will be very familiar, of something that was started by a single tweet by the general manager of the Houston Rockets basketball team, which was in support of the Hong Kong activists. That has set up a campaign against the NBA, the National Basketball Association, of unprecedented complexity. It's put them in an eye of an information campaign, both manipulation and disinformation, that ranges from states, competitors, and really unusually, left and right, or liberal and right-wing activists who are acting in concert together because their individual motivations suits at that particular time. So all 3 levels happening simultaneously. So what I just to assess the importance of it, if I can give you an analogy, the conversation that we're trying to start is probably the same conversation that was happening 6 years ago about cybersecurity. In the fact at that time it was all about whether air defense systems were going to be switched on and off, whether our critical infrastructure on and off, state on state, and then people finding their bank accounts were empty. We cannot divide the economic vulnerabilities. If I'm a malign actor, and I spend a lot of time thinking in the realms of a malign actor, what I'm going to go is go after your weakest point. I'm going to go sub-threshold. The sub-threshold is me attacking your jobs and your economic livelihood because it's really, really easy to do, and we need to start paying more attention to it.
Thank you, Alastair. Now, just to play around with the format a little bit, I've asked the panelists to each, because they represent different facets of this topic, I've asked them to ask questions of each other, so either an individual or for the whole group. Bret, what is your question?
Yeah, my question actually came up listening to John. My question is, what legal recourse does a company have if they let's say they purchase third-party ad tech and their ad shows up on an extremist site where they clearly do not want it to be? What recourse does that company have to go after Google AdSense, for example, if their ad shows up somewhere that's damaging to their brand reputation?
It's a great question. I'll also say that one of the positions that advertising agencies are finding themselves in more and more is that clients are trying to shift the liability onto the ad agency because we're the ones placing the ads. But of course, we're using as much technology as we can. And what Bret's talking about are verification companies that are able to detect and block inappropriate content. And hopefully, if this works correctly, we can, within the microsecond between when you click and an ad renders, we can recognize whether the ad is appropriate or inappropriate. If it's inappropriate, we stop the ad from running. The problem is that Google and Facebook and some of the other social networks do not allow our JavaScript into their system for reasons of privacy and latency, which means that it'll slow the site down. We don't really accept that. So with that as a background, because of Section 230, they're protected. It's not an area that we're comfortable with at all, and it's something that we are trying to address with them as a marketing community through something called the Global Alliance for Responsible Media. And if necessary, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it's a sore point with the industry. We have very, very little recourse, and unfortunately, both Google and Facebook are so powerful that many clients find themselves in a position not unable to stop using them because they're contributing so strongly that they really can't do anything about it. They just have to live with it. So right now, our only recourse is naming and shaming in the press, and then hopefully this has got the attention of legislators, and you've heard what Elizabeth Warren in the US wants to do is break up the big tech companies because they've just become too powerful because they can misbehave in this way.
Michelle.
So Bret, so thank you for that. And so I'll just jump off that. So off the civil penalties. Within the United States, the way this has been prosecuted has been under wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, as well as computer intrusion. So depending on prosecutorial discretion, the nature of the organized crime network behind the ad fraud, I think it would depend how they frame that, but there can be criminal penalties in addition to the civil penalties, that could be addressed in this. It kind of depends on how the fraud was perpetrated. So in these instances, this was, manufactured, impressions, not just against the brand reputation, but outright financial fraud. So companies reported these to federal law enforcement, who through the course of their investigation, then determined that there was, in this particular case, Russian organized crime behind it. In addition, the other two markets where we see organized crime coming out of this is China and increasingly the Middle East. So I think it's a matter of how the fraud was perpetrated, is that it could absolutely have criminal penalties against it. The challenge with this is, as I'm sure you gentlemen know, is corporations aren't necessarily going to raise their hand and say, I was defrauded, because that's its own brand of risk. So sometimes these things are covered by cyber insurance, if there's, and there is risk to reporting this because, then it goes public, so we find that a lot of times when a corporation is a victim in white collar crime, they're reluctant to report. And so the criminal side of it doesn't necessarily take off. The other thing I would bring up in terms of legal remedies for this is one example that could be classified as, a disinformation attack was the North Korea attack on Sony, which was actually, and I really appreciate your points on this, Alastair, is it's very complex, and we see a lot of slippage between nation state and corporate actors. When North Korea attacked Sony with ransomware, it actually affected multiple American media companies because of the way, as I'm sure you know, Bobby, is, the way the contracts are made and the rights are bought. This affected NBC Universal, it affected Sony, many, right? So the economic impact was huge, not just to Sony. That investigation, initially it was thought, the 14-year-old in the mom's basement, turned out that this was what appeared to be a corporate actor was actually acting on behalf of the North Korean government. So this actually was a case of cyber warfare and cyber espionage, which then the Department of Justice has to address in a very different way. And I think some of the international laws are a little murkier around that. So I think the way to address this legally depends a little bit on the very complex nature that, I think we've outlined here.
I would add too that most of the perpetrators of these crimes are outside of the country in which they occur. So much of the ad fraud we see is organized out of the East and out of Eastern Europe, that it's just impossible to go after them. The best remedy is to try and cut them off at the source. But I think to Bret's point, certainly the platforms aren't taking responsibility for carrying that. However, they do take the money.
Can I ask a question before I ask you to ask yours? You brought up the Sony incident, and Sony was a wake-up call. The attack on Sony was a wake-up call for a lot of companies. Sony was, as we discovered, deeply, deeply vulnerable to this, essentially a form of hack. And companies have started spending money and paying attention to the vulnerabilities of their network since then. But you don't have to infiltrate a company's network in order to use misinformation, disinformation, to do it damage, to do it reputational harm, to the point that you're making, John. Have we reached a point where, people trying to do damage to a company or a brand can use social media using bots and cutouts to hurt a brand or a company? Have we reached that stage yet? Are companies aware of the risks that come from social media, and are they can they indeed protect themselves from that kind of attack?
Yeah, it's an emerging risk. I'll give you two examples. One of them is a very, very large cosmetics company who was attacked, and there was some disinformation about animal testing around their brand, and that caused a furor. There are many opportunities like that, and I'm surprised we haven't seen more. Another situation that we had was when one of a large global brand was pulled in front of the Vietnamese Minister of Information because their ad appeared adjacent to disinformation about the Vietnamese government. And that's against the law in Vietnam. It's a totalitarian regime. And so it was a very, very embarrassing thing for the brand and for the agency. Those are two slightly different types of ways that brands have been risks. But it's emerging, and it's a real worry. And as I said a little earlier on, very difficult to detect unless that site is a known source of disinformation. It has to happen before you then put them on the blacklist the next time.
So I'd say there's a structural issue, which militaries and governments are kind of about 3 years ahead. So if you look at what's happening within, for example, military communities, is putting together and trying to reduce the boundaries between intelligence, cyber, and communications, to use its broadest term, so the engagement part. Because there's a realization that you don't want any boundaries between it. You want to understand, you want to decide, you want to react in a simultaneous way. If you look around the C-suite and you look at people go, well, it's cyber. Well, no, it's not. Well, it's comms. I'll let the comms guy. Well, no, it's not. It's a combination of all. And the people who really get it are the CEOs, the general counsel, because they're aware of that particular. The other part is a lack of education. I've had numerous discussions with people going, yeah, we're all over this. We've got massive coverage on Facebook and Twitter. And you go, okay, so you're looking through a straw at about 5% of your problem. whereas trying to get people to understand that where those threats are emanating from are not on those two particular platforms. To get people to talk about, risks emerging from gaming or fringe networks or the smaller platforms is a really difficult conversation because of a lack of education and awareness. And as Jeff was pointing out over lunchtime, that if you've heard of a platform at board level, it's probably too late.
Michelle, did you have a question?
I actually just wanted to add on that is the nature of these hacks aren't necessarily network intrusions, right? So I completely agree with you. And sharing an Army background, we were joking about the information operations in the green room, but the military does have a very different perspective on this, where we don't separate, comms and cyber and like the email, and incorporate IT systems. These tend to be very compartmentalized groups, and the corporate cybersecurity posture has traditionally been one of a defensive moat thinking, like, I'm going to protect against network intrusion, when actually the real danger comes in from letting the enemy in the front door and not realizing it. So traditionally, this type of cybercrime was done through business email compromise, right, which was the old way of doing disinformation, right? This is, the Nigerian uncle sending, the 419 scams, we call them, right? Well, businesses became savvy about this, so started adding, filters, on email, educating people on spear phishing and phishing. What's happened now is criminals are very adaptive, right? They're studying this as well, and they're realizing, what? Nobody's using email anymore, right? Everyone's, WhatsApping each other, they're tweeting each other. So criminals have moved and shifted the threat landscape from email to social media. So now they're embedding, as you noted, malware and malicious content, so they can enter, a corporate network not only from, email or an actual, hacking attempt or computer intrusion, but simply sharing. You share an email, a Facebook post with somebody while you're on the corporate network, and there it goes. The danger to the second part of your question is, are corporations prepared for this? My answer would be largely no, is because there's still in the cybersecurity community a much more defensive posture that looks solely at infrastructure and networks. And what really needs to be looked at is the information landscape, to borrow a term Shuki used earlier, but that looks at the information architecture, because information no longer generally resides within a corporate data center or on corporate servers. That has all been outsourced. So it's in the cloud on Google, at Microsoft. So the attack surface is very different. And I will say it is rare for corporations to have a good understanding of their information architecture, because that requires an investment in a specific type of talent and effort that, they see that as too expensive. So it generally, I still think that they're generally unprepared.
Did you have a question for the others?
I did. So actually, I'm going to direct my question to Bret. We've talked a lot about Russia in here, and as well as in the past 2 days. But I know from your work, you've done some case studies on other areas of the world where this can be a threat and destabilization to democracies. So I was interested if you had some good case studies for us, let's say from Latin America or an area of the world we have not addressed as much in the forum here today.
I don't have great case studies on Latin America, unfortunately.
Or others. I just
yes.
thought of
It's a very good question, and I know more Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So you can certainly look at the vulnerabilities being amplified in areas that do not have a strong tradition of independent media. So for example, I lived in Hungary for many years. So the ability of, still through the Russian context, but the Russian government to message around, they wanted to implement a nuclear plant, PAX-2. their ability to get that messaging out into the Hungarian traditional media is much broader than they could do in the US. In the US, it remains sort of in the social media ecosystem, which can do a lot of damage. It will probably leak other places. But in countries that don't have a strong tradition of independent media, it's much easier to plant those stories directly in places that have credibility. And I think that's where the real danger. But if I can sort of piggyback on another point that Alastair raised that goes to it, talking about a different threat actor, I don't think we figured out how to even define the China threat at this point. Talking about the NBA, my previous job was working in Hollywood for many years. Hollywood hasn't made a movie with a Chinese antagonist since 1997. Now, that's not interference, it's not disinformation, but it's also not public diplomacy for the Chinese government to say to Mandalay Pictures, where I worked, if you make another movie like 7 Years in Tibet, you're done. You're cut off from a country of 1 billion people. I don't think we've even started to think about that as a threat.
So the whole China Information Week is a 5-day conference on its own. But so we have a lot of discussions. So I'll try and pick up on both. So if you're looking at areas, for example, of the due diligence process, it is becoming absolutely a corporate need for areas, for example, like Mexico, like Brazil. People understand that if we want to make investments in it, they have to understand that information environment and the architecture is fundamentally different. Other areas that are of particular interest to corporate, the Philippines. Everyone is aware that you can't do business in the Philippines without understanding those two types of information risks. The big one, and the one that personally we have more discussions about and trying to explain, is the difference between the US, particularly the US and Chinese information ecosystem. And not just that one is good and one is bad. They're just different. They operate in different ways for different cultural, historical, and economic reasons. Both don't understand the other. It's not just that US companies and multimedia don't understand China. Chinese companies don't understand the US information ecosystem. They apply their own sort of model on top of it, which is wrong. And there's a danger of a misunderstanding between both, rather than there being any malign purpose behind the sort of corporate aspects to it.
John, did you have a question for the others?
Yeah, I think it's a question for us all, really. We've been spending the last 2 days talking about the causes and the solution of disinformation. We've talked about possible legislation. We've talked about the detecting it through technology and AI and rating publications and detection via blockchain. And all of those things are really good. But I wonder if we're not examining the cause rather than the symptom. And I think the truth about disinformation is that it works. It sways political opinion. It enriches those that exploit it. It provokes hate and discord for those that propagate it. So shouldn't we be focusing all of our efforts helping people to think for themselves? I prepared this before Christopher did his speech, so thank you, Christopher. We're in accord. But what would happen, and so that's about education. And I know it's long term, but we have to start somewhere. And then you say, well, who will do the educating? You know, that's always the problem. Are these ad campaigns that need to be funded by someone? Well, what happens if every news organization in the world, and this is very utopian, but if every news organization in the world took it amongst themselves to educate their viewers and readers about disinformation. And obviously they would do it in their own way. Fox News would do it in a different way to the BBC, but that's what democracy is about, right? And so I think, and at a base level at schools, insisting that digital literacy is part of the curriculum, and making sure that disinformation is there as well. So, you know, perhaps we can learn from the Ukraine, who reacted this way in a moment of extreme crisis, but I wonder if we're not closer to that crisis than we think. So I know it's a long-winded kind of open-ended question, but it really is, if we focus on education, that seems to be focused on the cause rather than the symptom.
Who wants to start?
I agree that, because you're absolutely right. I've heard many of the esteemed speakers bring up digital literacy and media literacy as very important. And I completely agree with that. I mean, I don't see that is absolutely fundamental. However, I want to bring up something you mentioned, John, and tie into what you just spoke about earlier, Bret, is we're talking about, the news media, right? Giving people, the ability to discern and understand what is fake and what is not. And assuming that there's a reliance on a traditional media organization, which, as we know, is changing. As you pointed out, Bret, Russian actors in Hungary can target their traditional media system, but part of the challenge is the changing nature of the news industry is a contributing factor to the challenges around digital and media literacy. Out of University of North Carolina, they've done some amazing work around the concept of news deserts.
Yes.
And so for those of you who aren't familiar with this concept, they were tracking across the United States at the county level. So this is at smaller than the state level, so similar to like a Swiss canton type thing. The existence or lack thereof of newspapers at the county level, and they were looking at the rate of closure of newspapers, and they defined a news desert as any county that had 2 or less newspapers, because over time, the traditional media organizations have been either bought out by corporate overlords, or they've just folded and disbanded. So the risk is there's pockets, and there's significant pockets throughout the United States that are actually now news deserts that have no newspapers whatsoever. So the, not just the youth, which we want to educate, but adults don't have access to traditional media. When you have a vacuum like that, people are always going to search information. So this is how they trip upon Bob's conspiracy website, right? Because there's nothing left open to them, right? So interestingly, what I started doing this summer was taking that UNC data and actually correlating it, not against, I know we've been talking a lot about terrorism, but also white extremist and white supremacist organizations in the United States. So I was correlating this against FBI data for the Uniform Crime Report on hate crimes, as well as the Southern Poverty Law Center data, which correlates the existence of hate groups. And what I found was a very high degree of correlation is those areas of the United States that were news deserts, that contained no news media, were also the ones in which we saw the most, like Texas, the most violent hate crimes. So I think the challenge in all of this is, as the news landscape is changing, the concept of what is literacy, news literacy, is changing, as well as you pointed out, the threat landscape. So I think that one thing we have to build into that is, is that something we should be addressing as well?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think to come back to the point about misinformation and disinformation, that's easier to do in a desert. In a desert where there is no information, it's easier to introduce malinformation because there is no corrective. There's no local institution that people rely on and trust, and that can push back against the fake news, for want of a better.
And a lot of that is being caused by Google and Facebook sweeping in and taking all of the ad revenue. I think they're aligned but slightly different issues, and to defend my point, I think, is to say that there's a real crisis in news, particularly in local news, and it needs to be addressed. But it's still the best mouthpiece we've got. It's imperfect, but there are still tens of, if not hundreds of thousands of newspapers and television stations and radio stations out there that can help start address this. At the same time, addressing it with our youth. And I think that Jeff said it so well earlier on, is that particularly people in the totalitarian regimes tend to be more sophisticated at spotting bullshit. And I think that's the I think the educating needs to happen in the first world countries in particular.
Can I disagree?
Yes, you can in a second. I'm just keenly aware that we have a little more than 5 minutes left. So I also want you to have a chance to ask your question. So go ahead and weigh in on this.
I want to disagree first, because all panels agree, but I want to disagree with you.
There you go.
So I passionately believe that what we're talking about here is threat. Threat comes from people. This is people. This is organizations and people who are doing this. So education and literacy, I can't, it's great, and it's a tool. And I forget who it was that put up the quote from Steve Bannon, who talked about mobilization, which all he's doing is paraphrasing from Ellul's propaganda doctrine. That's all it is, but he describes it as agitation. So where you look at societies that are resilient, or more resilient to this, so I'm not sure there's anyone here from Lithuania, but Lithuania, as a society, as a government, as a media, as institutions, is resilient to disinformation because the population, the country has been mobilized against the existential threat to their way of life. Norway's moving into that space as well. That's mobilization. It's not education, it's mobilizing and counter-mobilizing to a force that's trying to mobilize your own will against you. Unless we get into mobilizing and getting people to realize the existential threat. So recent polls have shown that most people in Western Europe recognize that disinformation is a threat, but not a threat to them. Until that changes, education doesn't do any good.
Did you have a question for the rest of the group?
I did, and it's to John. So is the advertising industry the root of all evil? Because we seem to blame the platforms. Hey, I work for a publisher, so I'm not letting them off. But surely the example that was given this morning of pressure from Unilever that changed a behavior in a platform, the advertising industry as a whole holds a massive influence. Could it not be, used to change that behavior?
I have a corollary before you answer that, John. So we often hear in the realm of political misinformation and disinformation, the use of the platforms. Political parties are constantly complaining that the platforms don't respond to their complaints about misinformation, and if they do respond, it's too slow. The poison seeps in before they respond. Are platforms more responsive to corporate complaints?
So let me tackle Alastair's first. I think that the marketers are the victims, but they also can do more to help solve the problem. It's their money, and you can imagine the conversation that I have with marketers when they hear that 20% of their impressions in Thailand are subject to ad fraud, and that means that they're losing 20% of their budget. It's a hard conversation to have. But then, the question I think you're asking is, well, why don't they just simply shift the revenue or the ad budget away from those perpetrators? And a lot of the disinformation that's happening, or maybe even all of the disinformation that's happening, is on the social platforms. And this is the hard conversation because if you're a brand in Thailand and 75% of your spend is on Facebook or on Google, or in particularly on Facebook, and you're making your numbers as a result of that, it's a hard thing to be able to just pull that revenue. It's frustrating for me because I think that's the only real it's the only real message that media will understand. At the end of the day, they'll take it really seriously. Google responded for the first time. In February 2017, there was a London Times article that asserted that big brands fund terror. In fact, it started probably the brand safety practice that I now run. There was about $1 billion pulled out of Google. It didn't affect their results in any way, but reputationally they were damaged in the press, and then they started reacting. And I think you're right. I don't think that they're root of all evil, but they certainly could be doing more. And I think that, Bobby, the platforms are protected by Section 230. So it's a big issue, and I think that Section 230 was useful in the establishment of big tech companies in Silicon Valley, but that was in the late 90s, and I think the situation has changed now, and they've become massively, massively powerful and almost untouchable, and that's a real issue that needs to be addressed, not just by the politicians, but by the marketers.
I agree. Section 230, and this is a U.S. law around the Communications Decency Act, which gives digital platform companies a safe harbor against prosecution for malign behavior that occurs on their platform, and it has shielded them to a significant extent. That being said, I think, to your point, Bobby, they cooperate much more closely with their corporate customers because they see them as a revenue stream, and are much more reluctant to cooperate with governments. And we've seen that repeatedly in the past 2 years, where there's been very lukewarm or ineffective engagements with governments who've asked them to intervene. Some of it is lack of expertise, lack of will, quite frankly. Like at the end of the day, they're evaluated in the stock market as private companies on 2 metrics, a number of users and ad dollars. So anything that interferes with that is going to get in their way. So do we need to step up? Yes. Last week, the US and the UK signed a historic data sharing agreement, which still has to be ratified by Congress, but specifically to bypass Section 230, because the reluctance to share data with law enforcement is hampering investigations out of the UK, US, and Australia. So this is going to mandate, because I mean the other kind of elephant in the room on this platform here is that the digital platform companies that we're talking about are all American owned. Right? So the fact that they're operating as a multinational corporation with, affecting countries around the world, they are nonetheless American corporations shielded by American law. And until there's both voluntary cooperation from these countries, but I think what we're going to start seeing is many more bilateral and multilateral agreements like we saw between the U.S. Department of Justice and the U.K. Home Office, to kind of bypass this, to say, if you're not going to cooperate, we'll force your hand.
I think we could have gone on for quite a lot longer. I think we could have broken this up into little sub-subjects and gone on for hours, but we have run out of time. Alastair, John, Michelle, and Bret, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel.